Stewart, it is a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm well.
Cool. So typically we would start these with a question asking the students, how many of you use Slack? But since it's the official communication platform for the GSB, we're gonna have to do something a little different. How about a game of two truths and a lie?
All right.
Cool. So up here on the screen in just a second, we're gonna see three statements that I pulled from my extensive research of your past. We're gonna have to ask the audience to guess which one of them is a lie. So, statement one, you were born with the name Stewart Butterfield. Okay. Statement two, you have 2 philosophy degrees. All right. Statement three, Flickr, your first successful startup, was conceived while battling with food poisoning. Okay, so the audience, raise your hand if you think statement one is false. Oh, wow, that's a lot of people. Raise your hand if you think statement two is false. Okay. Raise your hand if you think statement three is false. Okay. Stewart?
People are pretty good. It's number one.
It's number one. So you were not born Stewart Butterfield.
I was born Dharma Jeremy Butterfield to hippie parents in a little town called London, British Columbia, which is literally the end of the road. So Pacific Coast Highway is the same road that goes all the way down to Chile and then all the way up to where the fjords of British Columbia, and the fact that there's no people living any further north means that it was foolish to continue building the road. So born there and grew up in a log cabin for the first couple of years.
Grew up in a log cabin. Abe Lincoln also grew up in a log cabin.
Yeah, that's why I bring it up for the positive associations.
Yeah, so trust me, I understand. My parents named me Tylon Garrett. And as a 4-year-old, I was not writing Trevorsky on every spelling test.
Yeah.
So I go by Tylon, and you actually know me by Ty.
Yeah.
So
TY is very the thing is, so when I was 12, I really wanted to be normal, and for some reason I thought Stewart was a normal name, like Mike or something like that. And Stewart's it's a pretty bad name. Like, you'll notice this after I say it. Anytime you watch a movie, TV show, there's a character named Stewart. There's like the jerk version, and then there's like the sad sack kind of loser version. There's never a protagonist, with the exception of the mouse, Stuart Little.
Stuart Little. That was one of my favorite movies growing up. So if you could pick any name today, what would it be?
It would be Dharma Jeremy Butterfield. That's a sick name.
Cool. So you hinted a little bit on your parents. What have been the most lasting influences from their parenting style?
That's a good question. I mean, it's hard to separate out that from what life would have been without those influences. My mom is incredibly supportive, to the extent that when I was 16, I got in a car accident, just totaled the car, my dad's car, and my mom's reaction was, well, it's really good that you did that because you learned an important lesson about driving safety. Which is not the reaction I was expecting. My dad was a real estate developer, and real estate development usually works, people incorporate a new entity for each project or each development. Maybe there's a management company that takes management fees, but it kind of isolates the investments, which means that it's like creating a business over and over again. Like every 2 or 3 years, there's a fundraising cycle, and there's kind of putting together the vision and a plan. And then over the next decade or so, that plays out. So I think that was a big influence for me, just because I got to see the development of, I don't even know, but over the course of my childhood, once I was aware of what was going on, maybe 5 or 6 different businesses.
Wow.
And that was good practice, because I think I started looking at the world that way.
That's cool. That's cool. So you were born Dharma Butterfield. You were raised by parents who aspired to live off the land. It only makes sense that you would be drawn to technology. So what led you to teach yourself to program at the age of 7?
Computers were just so cool. And even, you see now any 3-month or 6-month-old is just drawn to the iPad in a way that seems like it must be indicative of like a lower level brain function that was hijacked in order to be attracted to this. So for me, any screen, just like any child, any screen was just super attractive. But the idea that you could control what appeared was really magical. And this 1979, 1980, somewhere around there, I got an Apple IIe at home. So and we had one in the classroom. So the very first class at my school to have a computer in the classroom. And I would buy a copy of a magazine called Byte, which in the back couple of pages had programs that you could just type out yourself in Apple Basic, and you could change a couple things and see what happened. And it was really, I have difficulty describing like why it had such a powerful hold. But what was interesting is if you fast forward like 20 years, there was, I had an early game console called an Intellivision. So liked video games like most boys my age. There was arcades where you went and put quarters in machines and stuff like that. But computers themselves became less and less interesting to me over the course of high school. But when I got to college, I got an account on the school's Unix machine and discovered the internet. This was 1992. And that was just totally mind expanding. And I almost couldn't believe that such a thing was possible. And it had like the same feeling of wonder, but to a higher degree, because it was like we as a species had developed the ability to transcend geography in a much more profound way than like long distance phone calls had or the telegraph had. You could find community. I grew up was going to college in Victoria, British Columbia, which is again on the edge of the continent, very remote, kind of provincial. And you could find people who were interested in exactly what you were anywhere in the world, and that communication was happening at the speed of light. So that really opened it up. And then fast forward another 10 years, so like in the early 2000s, I had this experience finally where I had my laptop with me, and what at one point in my life had been like the Steve Jobs bicycle for the mind, like this incredible machine that anything was possible and all this amazing software, when it wasn't connected to the internet, was inert. It was basically kind of useless. It was like a rock. So it's a very interesting experience to think about like the successive layers of what really matters. The first one being that ability to run arbitrary code, so to generate more or less anything that a human can imagine, and then the ability to put all of those together. And I think that was like the thing that has guided my career ever since, is the exploration of that idea of computing technology as a means of facilitating human interaction.
It's amazing. So that's what drew you to technology initially, but you actually studied philosophy. So what inspired that decision?
I really wanted to do a degree in cognitive science, but the school that I went to didn't have cognitive science. So cognitive science is usually computer science, psychology, linguistics, and psychology. And so I wanted to take courses in all four. To do an honors degree in psychology, it was like every single course was a requirement. In fact, you had to do like extra. Whereas philosophy is a pretty light set of requirements, even to do an honors degree. So I chose philosophy literally like that. It was like of those four, the one that had the fewest requirements. But after I started studying it, even though I did philosophy of mind, I was really interested in neuropsych as an undergrad. The fundamentals of philosophy I found super fascinating. And this sounds bad, and it is bad in one sense, and it's good in another sense. So you think about the last 2,500 years of kind of the history of inquiry of all different kinds. At some point, everyone was a philosopher. If you were interested in the world in an a-religious way, so like the beginnings of science, it was philosophy. At some point, mathematics, geometry, astronomy split off over the next many hundred years. Things like biology in the 19th century split off into its own discipline, and psychology, anthropology, sociology, computer science, linguistics, women's studies, until all you had left was like an area of inquiry that is not directed at anything except for like itself and language. So in one sense, it's really boring. So if you didn't ever study philosophy and you pick up a book of like contemporary Anglo-American analytic philosophy, it is super, super boring. Like it's almost impenetrable without like this giant vocabulary of ways to get into it. But once you're into it, I still find it really fascinating because there's so many unanswerable questions.
It's good to know. So who was the most influential philosopher to you?
I have a pretty broad range, and I liked all kinds of thinkers, but like back to Aristotle, Spinoza, more contemporary, Quine and Donald Davidson. But if there was one, it was Wittgenstein, because that's why I ended up going to Cambridge.
Amazing, amazing. So we're in 1997 now. You're armed with 2 philosophy degrees and a name fit for a philosopher, Butterfield. Mm-hmm. But you decided to become a web developer. What led you back into technology?
Well, so like I said, I got to college in '92, which was like at least for my awareness, 6 months to maybe a year before the web really took off. Like I think Mosaic had been invented, but wasn't really widely deployed. So the internet was email, IRC, a Unix program called Talk. More than anything else, it was Usenet. And that meant that as soon as the web became a popular medium that started supplanting things like Gopher and Waze, I was there. And it was really, the HTML back then was just dead simple. So very easy to teach yourself. So in '93, I was, I don't know, one of 5 people in my hometown who knew HTML, which meant that in '94, '95, '96, every year my summer job, but also just my job during the school year was making websites for people who didn't know how to make websites, because pretty much no one did. And it was like '98, I finished my master's and was enrolled in the PhD. And it was the beginning, so a friend of mine had just finished his PhD in philosophy and went to a great school and did great thesis work and was really like at the top of the range, and got his first job, which was at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, and he really didn't want to live in Kentucky, and it was a crappy job with low pay, and it's a sessional position, so it renews every 9 months. And I thought of how many hoops I had to jump through just to get to that point. Or because it was '98 and the dot-com thing was starting to take off, and I knew the web, and all of my friends who were like early web people were moving to San Francisco and getting jobs that paid 2 or 3 times as much, and it was exciting and dynamic, and we were changing the world. So I had advice from a couple professors over the course of my career who essentially were, this is a terrible life, please don't become an academic. If you're interested in this stuff, you can subscribe to the journals and attend the conferences. You don't have to actually do a PhD and then go be a professor. So I took that advice.
Okay, that's good to know. So I'm actually curious, raise your hand if you have a humanities degree. Okay, keep your hand raised if you're considering a career in technology. Okay, so my question there is, what were the advantages and disadvantages in having a humanities degree within the technology industry?
It's tough because, I mean, there's multiple technology industries. So I would say when I started in '98, like the web was tech, but it was populated much more by people with a background in like graphic design or architecture if you're making web development. The serious back-end programmers had a parallel track to web server development, but it was really like a totally different era, and there wasn't anything in between, like the architects and the graphic designers on one side, and the people, this won't be a familiar reference to many of you, but the people using WebLogic and ATG, Dynamo, and these, like, from today's contemporary perspective, kind of really horrible application servers that had a fundamentally different approach to doing web development. It was stateful applications, things like enterprise Java beans. And so I don't think it really made any difference what your background was at that point. It could have been history, it could have been finance, it could have been physics. And meanwhile, there's a different technology industry, which is like all of the descendants of Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel and HP and a bunch of companies that were native to this area. But that was completely different. Like it would, the design of circuit boards and processors and the manufacturing computers was totally unrelated to the web. And still today, I think we say tech industry broadly. I think mostly what people mean is, at least around the Bay Area, is companies that receive VC backing as opposed to anything else. They're not necessarily specifically technology companies, and the side effect of software eating the world in the famous Mark Andreessen phrase, is that every company is a technology company. So you can look at like, I don't know, Visa or MasterCard, probably employ close to an order of magnitude more software developers than Stripe. Even though everyone would say Stripe is a technology company, is PayPal a financial services company or a tech company? Is Airbnb a tech company or a hospitality company? It becomes increasingly hard to make that distinction, unless you mean like technology is Huawei making 5G antenna chips, and it's like Dell, and then software businesses like Slack.
Okay, thank you for that. So you worked as a web designer for a few years before starting a video game company and launching your first video game, Game Never Ending. What was your vision for that game?
So when I said 92, the thing that was most interesting to me about the internet was Usenet. Usenet is those of you who don't know it, a hierarchical directory of news groups, and it covered more or less everything. So they began with a three-letter abbreviation, so SCI was science, and there was science, physics, and geology, and so on. And then rec.music.gdead, Grateful Dead, was in 92 the Netflix of its time, in the sense that it used more bandwidth than any other single thing on the internet. There's so much traffic of people discussing Grateful Dead that it kind of just surpassed everything else. So 93, I guess, probably a year later, I had the first experience of having a crush on someone that I had never actually met, but was just like from her online persona, her SIG files, the things she said in comments. And the idea that kind of connection was possible was, I mean, this really early stage, but it was very interesting to me. You go forward to 98, 99, 2000, and people had blogs. There were the early social networks like 6 Degrees, and then Friendster was probably 2002-ish, around there. But people had started kind of developing a persona and having interactions with other people over the internet in a bunch of different virtual communities. Some of those were really explicit, like the Wells are like one of the ancient ones, but bulletin board systems, discussion boards, moos, kind of like interactive chat-based games. And I said earlier that the idea of social interaction mediated by computing technology, like the new possibilities that opens up, was a thing that was really fascinating to me. So when you say game, I think people have the assumption that there's puzzle games, and there's shooting games, and there's sports games, and stuff like that. This was none of those, and this was just play as a pretext for social interaction. So this is a description that may or may not have appeal to some of you. I will tell you that it does not have broad commercial appeal. And that's, it's this like whimsical world of like absurdist humor and kind of hopefully delightful little things to discover, but it's mostly like a venue for people to interact and to form community with one another. And super popular among the small group of people for whom we developed this prototype and we're testing it. But that was 2002. So some of you were just little babies in 2002. But there was the dot-com crash, which started in 2000. There was the WorldCom and Enron accounting scandals. There was 9/11. It was just like a really dark time for financial markets. The NASDAQ was down, I think, 80 or 85% from its peaks, and the S&P 500 was down 65%. It's kind of like hard to imagine, even in comparison to 2008. So no one wanted to invest in internet stuff, period. But definitely no one wanted to invest in web-based, massively multiplayer games, because that was just like as frivolous as you could possibly be, which meant that no one would invest in us, and we didn't have enough money to finish it, and we tried to cast around for something that we could do with the technology that we had developed that would create a commercially viable product. And that turned out to be Flickr.
Yeah, so ironically, Game Never Ending did end.
Yep.
So how did you feel when you realized you had to shut down the game?
Horrible. But at the same time, it kind of happened. Like we were developing Flickr and the game side by side for a couple of months. The decision to make Flickr and then its launch was, it's 3 months separating those, so it happened pretty quickly. But in that case, it felt like it was a path forward. The team got to stay together. We had I think we disappointed a lot of the people who were playing it, but also a lot of them were like, well, cool, Flickr is interesting too, and they just kind of migrated. So that wasn't that bad.
That's good. So you realize you have to shut down the game, but not before flying to one last video game conference in New York. What happens next?
So it was a conference on law and virtual worlds, and it was in New York, and flew from Vancouver, where I was living, and got food poisoning on the flight. And I don't want to make it too vivid, but it's just like puking in the immigration hall at JFK, puking in the cab on the freeway, get to the hotel, and like step out of the cab and puke all over the carpet of the hotel. So sorry, a little vivid. But I couldn't keep down anything, like ginger ale, water, and that night at like 3 a.m, after being up and kind of feverish and frantic, wrote out the whole first version of Flickr, like what it would be and how it would take advantage of those technologies. I will say this though, that was the very first version, which is very different than one it ended up becoming and was not actually very good. That it got us going.
So am yet to have a battle with food poisoning be so productive. So kudos to you there. You decided to focus on Flickr. When you made that shift, did everyone on your team buy in immediately, or what was that process like?
No, so I'm a pretty democratic leader sometimes. Maybe less so now than back then. But we had a vote, and it was a tie. And I was like, ugh. So I called Eric Costello, who's actually one of the founders of Slack as well, and just like did some background lobbying to get him to change his vote so that we could go ahead with it. There's definitely there's people who are still interested in making the game and felt like it was a shame to leave it behind. It was also, I think, in terms of the number of people online, way too early. The technology that was available, way too early. I think people forget, 2002 was the first year that any country got more than 50% internet penetration at home, and that was the Netherlands. And even then, that was almost all dial-up connectivity, so most Americans didn't have internet access. If they did, it was at work, and it was very kind of narrowly prescribed. And if they did anything online, it was like maybe check sports stores and like stock prices or something like that. So there wasn't really a market for it. But I just like making software, just in the same way that I did when I was 7 years old, and I think everyone else on the team did too, so we just got to make a different kind of software. And in the end, it was, the game was play as a pretext for social interaction. Flickr was photography as a pretext for social interaction. It was the first, actually we got bought by Yahoo, and one of the designers there called it massively multiplayer photo sharing, which I thought was pretty accurate, because it was the first thing, other than web shots, which I heard about later, where you could put a photo online and people could see it. And comment on it, and you could have a title and description, and you could tag it and create groups and all of that kind of stuff. So it was like a social network that revolved around photographs. And this is like, I think we started right around the same time as Facebook, but Facebook was still just at Harvard for another 6 months or a year, and then just the Ivies for another close to a year after that.
Cool. So not to spoil the story, but you eventually sell Flickr to Yahoo for excess of $20 million. I'm curious, looking back now as you're leading Slack, what lessons from your time at Flickr have been most influential on the leader that you are today?
It's hard to say because it was so long ago. Like we started development in 2003, launched in 2004, and then the winter break, like 2004, 2005, there's this big decision about whether we're going to take VC funding and we're going to get bought by Yahoo. So it was 2005 to 2008 that I was there, and there's definitely not something that stands as like the thing that I learned there, other than how hard it is to get something done, or how hard it is. I mean, maybe that is a good lesson. How hard it is to get something done in an organization of that size, because Yahoo is about 12,000 people, and I think there's a couple things that were wrong with it at that time, but the biggest one was it had basically stopped growing, and in an environment where the pie isn't growing anymore, suddenly the the kind of game theoretic, the calculus, especially among executives, is very zero-sum. So it was like people battling each other internally. But even to forget that for a second, any company of any organization of 10,000 people, it requires such an extraordinary injection of will to make anything happen that most things are, for all practical purposes, impossible.
Okay, so we fast forward to 2012. You have left Yahoo, which, by the way, if you have not read Stewart's resignation letter from Yahoo, please Google it. He likens himself to a tin smither named Brad. It's quite hilarious. So it's 2012. You're starting another video game company, this time Tiny Speck. At Tiny Speck, you launch a game called Glitch. What gave you more confidence in the gaming area this time around?
So it's 2009 that we started the company. And 2012 is when we shut it down. But it's the same group of people, so 4 of us who had worked on Flickr, and we all worked at Yahoo together. But 2002 to 2009 was a pretty amazing time in the history of the internet. So suddenly, everyone had internet access. And there were phones that were capable of internet access. There was Blackberries and Trios, and there were a lot of people had high-speed internet by that time. The world of open source software, specifically to support development on the internet, had just exploded. So there was really not much available in 2002. But by 2009, we had a very robust, mature Apache Foundation and all of these great networking technologies. People's computers were much faster. There's many more people online. We were much more experienced. It was very easy to raise money. So if you just look at any factor in a giant matrix of things that would lead this to be a good plan or to be successful, we had shifted from a 2 out of 10 to an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, except that that idea was still not very commercially viable. Same idea, better graphics.
Do you think that idea is ever going to be commercially viable?
Well, we could have kept going and paid all of our salaries and been happy, and it would have been interesting, but we had taken, by that point, $17 million in VC money. So I felt like it would have been an aberration of the responsibility and the kind of contract we made with them to just do that. So we had to think of something else.
So you said $17.5 million in funding you had. You were around 45 employees around the time. So you find yourself in a familiar situation and you have to shut down that game again. What was the toughest part about that decision the second time around?
So the second time around, it was very different because it wasn't just, hey, everyone, we are now as a group going to switch what we're working on, because there was animators and musicians and writers and illustrators, level designers, a whole bunch of people who just didn't have skills that were transferable to Slack. So a lot of people were going to get laid off. I think there was 35. And in the 3.5 years that we have been running the various versions of Glitch, there was a pretty strong and very active, robust community that wasn't like the couple hundred people who tested Game Never Ending could just start using Flickr. They were going to disappear. And I think this is a hard thing to relate to or understand if you haven't gone through it. And it's maybe something that hasn't happened in a long time and might not happen again. Tumblr seems like the last platform that had closed communities like that, whereas now everything, Instagram is just one world connected. To Facebook is one world. Twitter is everyone. And there are definitely sub-communities, but when communities exist in one specific platform and that platform disappears, it's a little bit like that moment in the first Star Wars when Alderaan gets blown up. It's just that society, that little culture, those relationships just won't exist anymore. So it's very, that was very sad. But obviously for me, it's, first of all, it's embarrassing. I did all this press and made all these claims. I had convinced all these people to come. I had convinced, anytime we got any press, I had convinced someone to do it. Every time we got invested, I had convinced someone to do it. But more than anything else, I had convinced all these people to come work on this. And I've told that story many times, but the day that I made the announcement internally, I called this all hands. And people were already a little bit apprehensive because we'd been through a couple of different, here's the last thing we're going to try. And this wasn't a day when we normally had an all hands. And I locked eyes with someone as soon as I started talking, who about 2 or 3 months before I had convinced to move to a new city with his wife and 2-year-old daughter away from where his in-laws lived, and his in-laws were helping take care of the kid. He moved to a new city, bought a house, and now I was going to tell him that he didn't have a job anymore. That was really, really hard. I mean, I think that's the impact on me reputationally or financially was, in the grand scheme of things, relatively insignificant. Like I would just bounce back again. But that's more than just disappointing someone. Like I was gonna come meet you for dinner and then I bailed at the last minute or something like that. This is like, I convinced you to alter the course of your life in a really significant way, and then it didn't happen. So that was very, very difficult. In the end, like a little bit of positive news, because we had $5.5 million left of that money, we were able to shut down in a relatively elegant way. So we made a portfolio site which had everyone's resumes and did a bunch of reference letter writing and kind of career coaching and helped get everyone a job, in most cases a better job than they had when they were working for us. And we were able to give customers the choice of their money back, or we could donate it to charity or whatever. But and that one person, Tim Leffler, ended up joining Slack like a year later, so that part all worked out too. But it doesn't mitigate at all like what it felt like in that moment. It was really, it was pretty terrible.
That's pretty heavy. So how did you go from that terrible moment to launching Slack, which reached a $1 billion valuation and record-setting pace of 8 months?
That worked out super well. I mean, we had developed this a system that was the proto Slack. Again, '92, I mentioned one of the software network tools that I used was called IRC, or Internet Relay Chat, and we used IRC at TinySpec, the company that made Glitch, and it's a very old technology. So it's with most messaging systems, probably every messaging system you've ever used, there's a concept of what's called store and forward. So if I'm going to send a message to you, but I can't reach you right now, like there's no connection to your endpoint, your client, or your device, it'll just be held and then forwarded to you the next time you connect. But IRC didn't have that. If you weren't connected at the moment that I sent the message, you would just never receive it. So we built the system to log the messages. But once we had the messages in the database, we wanted to be able to search them. So we built search on top of that. And then like bit by bit, kind of feature by feature, we built things to integrate with our file server. So when someone uploaded a file, it would get announced into IRC. Or if an alert went off in our data center, then that would get put into IRC. And slowly we developed the system, which was like really the foundation of all of the ways in which the company communicated, and was really beneficial. And so we realized, none of us are ever going to work without something like this ever again. Other teams of 8 software developers would probably like it as well. And so we decided that's what we're going to do. And we thought that one day, in the fullness of time, if we had every single person who could possibly use this, we would have $100 million in revenue and thereby be a $1 billion company. So, and that just happened very quickly.
Yeah, I definitely think the math checks out. So with Slack, you created a product that not a lot of companies knew they needed. How did you convince them otherwise?
That was tough. The first like 3 or 4 external teams to use Slack, it took dozens of tries, like going to their office and showing them. And I think we learned a lot there about marketing probably isn't the right term, but and I think we actually had this problem a little bit with Flickr because Facebook came out and just stole the social photo sharing market while Flickr was trying to decide whether it wanted to be social photo sharing or like a community for people who are interested in photography. But if you can't explain what you're doing well enough that someone to whom you explain it can go on to explain it to someone else, then it's a real problem, because otherwise you're going to have to do all the explaining. So we struggled to figure out the way to talk about it, like what advantages it had, what it was for. But when it's net new, when it's not replacing something else, it's very difficult. There's I don't know if it's still frequently read, but there's a classic book in marketing called Positioning, Jack Trout and Al Reese, I think. And one of the things they talk about is if something's a new concept for you, it's almost impossible for it to get purchase in somebody's brain, in somebody's mind. So you have to find something else that already exists there and then alter that idea, which is why you hear Uber for whatever. Because if you had to explain the whole thing from scratch, it's just very difficult. It's why you hear like movie pitches that are, Jaws meets Star Wars or something like that. And it's much easier to get that than to start from scratch. But it was a real slog to get anyone to even try it. And the encouraging thing was once people started trying it, they almost invariably stuck with it. They logged in every day. It became, like it was for us, the foundation of how they communicated.
Mm-hmm. And so from 2014 to 2017, there was limited competitors for Slack, given that it was such an innovative idea. But in 2017, when Slack had more than 100 million in revenue, which you predicted, 650 employees, and a valuation of around $5 billion, Microsoft launched their Teams app. How did you feel when you found out that app was coming out?
I think mostly just good because it validated the idea. And we had some advanced notice that it was coming out because we worked with Microsoft on some stuff, like early stuff with Microsoft Research on building question answering bots for Slack. And had a pretty good relationship with a guy named Chi Lu, who was a software exec at Yahoo, who was the CTO of Microsoft. Left around then to take over Baidu, but we weren't especially worried just because when it was first, before it was first announced, it was called Skype Teams, and it had a pretty different approach and was just so far behind us from a product perspective that we weren't worried about people switching.
Okay, so now in 2020, how do you feel about Microsoft's Team app?
Well, it got a lot better as Microsoft. I think there's a bunch of things that that make it much more of a challenge for us today than it was then. And it's not just that it's better, because it's actually not better enough compared to how it was that any of our large customers could switch to it. Like our biggest single user is IBM, somewhere close to 300,000 daily active users, over 10,000 workspaces, and Teams is limited to 5,000 users per workspace, and you can't federate them together, so there'd just be no way to support that kind of structure, so it wouldn't work for them. And there's many other things that are like very, very fundamental limitations. So for 5,000 people, you can have 200 channels. And if you want to add a 201st, you have to hard delete one with all of the messages. But none of that really matters in the face of if you want to be able to collaborate on a Word doc, like with track changes and send it back and forth, your lawyers working on a contract or marketing people working on a press release, and you are an Office 365 customer, you more or less have to use Teams now. And the 100 million users of Skype for Business are being migrated over to Teams because Skype for Business is being shut down. So there's a bunch of things that are kind of force it, but maybe most fundamental is we have 12 million. I don't even remember what our public number is on daily active users. 12? Yeah, okay. So 12 million, and there's at least 200 million people for whom Slack or something like it is the preferred way to work. So 200 million people whose working lives are mediated by email, and they're moving over, I think, is inevitable. So that's 6%, which means 94% of people don't use it yet. And if you don't use it and you don't have any idea, and you hear that there's two alternatives, one's Slack and one's Teams, and because you're an Office 365 customer, Teams is already free and integrated with all of your Microsoft tools, then why would you even evaluate Slack? Or Microsoft was aggressive in a way that I think was surprising to a lot of people, even who watch the company closely, like putting out a press release with our daily active users in it during our quiet period post the listing. But if they can put out a press release and tank our share price, then, and you're not watching this stuff very closely, you don't have a fine degree of resolution, then you might think as a customer, oh, why would I invest in Slack? If I think they're just going to be out of business in 3 years. Like Microsoft's going to inevitably kill them. That would be a waste of my time to even look at it. And it's not like at that point, the fact that they're different really matters to you because you don't use either and it's not really replacing anything. So it's much more of a threat now. I think we underestimated the degree of importance. Like the Financial Times Person of the Year was Satya Nadella. And so there's a big write-up of that, and there's 6 consecutive paragraphs that are about Slack. And there's no other, maybe the names of some competitive companies are mentioned in one sentence here and there, but like it's the biggest chunk of it. And so I think that's because of all the things that can be used as leverage by Microsoft to expand relationships inside of businesses, Exchange, the email server, and the fact that people are very used to Outlook is like the principal one that that kind of gets them in, and that makes it difficult for people to switch. And if people stop paying attention to email, if email declines in relative importance compared to the other software you use, that's a really difficult position for them. So from their perspective, I think, and this is what Chi Lu thought back like 2016, this is if Slack's successful to the maximum extent, that's an existential threat to Microsoft. And I don't think that's actually true because so many other things would change in the world on the path to that. But I think that is a thought process.
So despite selling out and actually becoming a consultant, I studied mechanical engineering in undergrad. Mm-hmm. And as a Black engineer, I really appreciate what Slack has been doing from the perspective of diversity and inclusion. Back in 2015, Slack shared a diversity report which revealed that most of their Black employees were in technical roles, contrasted with a lot of companies that will hire Black individuals primarily into administrative roles. And in that same report, 45% of managers were females. So to a room full of individuals who will start companies or be at companies, what advice do you have for creating diverse workplaces?
Start early. I think that's the biggest thing. When we were 20 employees, I would say, between 20 and 30 maybe, we're like, wow, this is a lot of white dudes. And in that case, it wasn't too late, but it was close to too late. It was like more of a slog to get started, because what happened was we have one Black woman engineer, and then another one comes to interview, and she sees the first one, and suddenly it's like a completely different assessment of what's going on here, and then there's 2, and then the third one comes for an interview, and like it feels like there's community, and people talk and have a network. So that getting started early, I think, is the most important thing, and I think it can be a kind of a fraught topic, I think, for people. Like, people aren't sure what to say, or they're uncomfortable. And I think there's a really pervasive and incorrect belief that you would have to lower the bar to hire someone who isn't like the canonical candidate, like the archetypal candidate for this role. I think that's usually not the truth for 2 reasons. One is, if you just have to look harder, you're going to see more people. And in fact, that can raise the bar. But people have different challenges in their life, and I don't think you can perfectly understand someone's background just from their gender identity or their ethnicity. But on the whole, for a woman to get to a certain place in her career, they had to work a lot harder than a man. For a Black engineer to get to a certain place in his or her career, they had to work a lot harder than, and this is where it gets fraught. In Ben Horowitz's words, Jewish, Chinese, or Indian guys in Silicon Valley, because there's just like these networks that are very powerful, and you have an enormous advantage. So for 2 people with like equivalent credentials, the person who's probably going to be more talented, more capable, and had to overcome more obstacles to get to where they are is going to be the one who doesn't have the traditional, archetypal presentation.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I hope people were taking notes. So we've gone through the journey of your career. You started as a web developer. You founded a company that was acquired by Yahoo. You launched a second company that raised more than $1.2 billion in venture funding, and you eventually took that company public. You've been a leader throughout this entire time. What has changed about your leadership style, and what stayed the same?
So it's always hard to really to assess yourself. I think I'm relatively self-aware even of those things that don't work, and it doesn't matter that I know that they don't work. I still can't change them. But there is a difference in the mechanics of being a leader at different scales, because when it's 20 people and we all kind of know each other, it's very different. Like I say something, and then we argue about it, and like maybe I change my mind, and it's all good. And, there's a power dynamic where I'm the CEO and whoever, and everyone else is not the CEO. But when you get to 500 people or 1,000 people, where we're at now, a couple thousand people, it's very different. Someone's going to come into a presentation for some new product development, and it's like a relatively new designer or engineer or product manager we've never met before. To me, this is just like one more 30-minute meeting in my schedule, which is and for them, this is something they've been thinking about for weeks. Like probably talk to their spouse about it, and they're either excited or they're nervous, they want to know. So the degree of impact that my words have is, like, from the perspective of me, crazy out of proportion to the amount of action. So in other words, like it's like, I don't know, a super, super powerful microphone on at all the time. So if anything's negative or critical, if I have a relationship with someone that we worked together for a long time, it's not really a big deal. If it's someone that, that might be the only time they interact with me ever in their whole career at Slack, or like, that might be the first interaction they've ever had with me, and they might not have another one for several years, it carries a huge amount of weight. So it's hard because, is that the amount of time we have, like, including questions from everyone?
That is.
Okay. I'll try to be a little bit more concise. I remember reading on Twitter people arguing about Warren's tax plan, and someone said something like, if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson just paid this tax at this rate, then we would have an extra $50 million, and then that's how much it would cost to solve the Flint water crisis. And it struck me as just a totally absurd argument, because the federal budget is something like $2.7 trillion. So $50 million plus or minus is not the reason why that doesn't get solved. It doesn't get solved for all kinds of reasons. And people think that way all the time, that it's just like money or it's just resources. For anything significant to happen, certainly anything that involves dozens of people, let alone hundreds or thousands, the amount of will that has to go in, the amount of, like, selling, the amount of vision, the amount of, like, coercion and cajoling, and the amount of encouragement and support, all of those things is just enormous. So the game does change as the company gets bigger and things evolve, and I think probably only gets more difficult. But that's what I've been learning this whole time is how to do that without, like, crushing people, how to do that without creating an environment where it's entirely top down, like iron fists from above. And it can be tough because I have a different perspective than anyone else because I see everything. So I talk to someone in engineering, I get head of sales reports to me, head of marketing reports to me, head of finance reports to me, our general counsel reports to me. So I have a very different perspective than what is ultimately relatively narrow and generally a better idea of what we need to do. Because I also talk to customers more than pretty much anyone else other than a salesperson, and I talk to our investors more than anyone else, and I talk to our board more than anyone else. Yeah, it's really, I think there are better sources than me for, like, top 10 tips. Because none of them seem that simple to me. And it's not that they're not out there, but the real challenge of leadership, and maybe there's one book I would recommend, which is Leadership and Self-Deception. the real like fundamental challenge of leadership is the same as the fundamental challenge of just being a human being, and I think that's this will sound a little bit weird, perhaps, but like living with an open heart and not seeing other people as, on one hand, either instruments that can be used to your advantage or obstacles that are in the way of something that you're trying to do, which is the kind of default judgment of all people with whom you are not close instinctually. So like you're on a Southwest flight and there's like, people are still boarding and the middle seat between you isn't taken. You're like, please don't take the seat, please don't take the seat, please don't take the seat. That person has a whole life, you know, and their own ambitions and desires and heartaches and stuff like that. But to you in that moment, they're just a potential pain in the ass that might take the middle seat next to you. And that's pervasive. And when you're really trying to accomplish something, it can be very tempting to see people either as instruments or obstacles.
Amazing. So we're gonna go to the audience we probably have a time for about 2 questions.
Hi, Stewart. Really appreciate your comments on diversity, so it makes me feel better about my Stanford Slack addiction. My question is, what were some of the key and best things you did on the product and design front in the early days of Slack? So, for example, how much of Slack's success do you attribute to your personal eye for design versus hiring the best designers versus feature prioritization or even just the insight about having a personality? Curious what advice you'd share there for aspiring entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I want to like slice it up by who gets more credit, but I think the fundamental approach was how much easier can we make people's lives? And when I look at other products, it's really I'm trying to think of like the shortest version of this I can. It can be an amazing app, and if the password reset thing doesn't work, and I need to reset my password to use it, then I'm just locked out. So there's very basic fundamental things that you can you have to get right, and which aren't the interesting ones. In fact, someone tweeted something the other day, which I liked, that kind of illustrates this from a different perspective. And it's someone asking Ray Kroc, the kind of founder and for CEO of McDonald's, why was McDonald's so successful? And he says, because we have clean bathrooms. And they say, that's easy. That's so simple. That doesn't explain it. And Ray Kroc said, are your bathrooms clean? And it actually is like a challenge. So there's some real fundamentals, but the things that we did that were most successful were those things which made life more convenient for people. And one of those was, for example, typing your password on your phone is a pain, so we'll send you a magic link that logs you in. Or because for complex reasons, most people wanted to have notifications for every message in Slack when they first signed up, so they felt comfortable and knew how it worked. But we didn't think that was a good way for them to set their preferences long term. After a few notifications, we would interject and say, would you like to switch to our preferred settings? And that kind of thoughtfulness or consideration, that kind of thinking of yourself as a host and the customers as your guests, I think is the secret, as it were, to good design.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. So in your answers, it was really clear that what you've been interested in is kind of facilitating communication through different mediums, whether it be video games, photography, now Slack. Was that understanding clear to you through your journey? And if not, was there like an aha moment that you realized this is what the issue you really wanted to work on was?
Yeah, the desire was there, but I didn't think I recognized it as one single thing, because Slack is also a massively multiplayer workplace software. That's the kind of the principal distinction between Slack and pretty much every other tool. And it is very much like the games that we wanted to play. You take objects and you can manipulate them and distribute them and form groups and all of that. But I don't think I really recognized them as being fundamentally similar until much later. The thing that I thought as being the common thread was just it's all software. And software that groups of people use together, to me, is the most interesting set of challenges, because it has all the regular challenges of scalability on the one hand and design and usability on the other. But social dynamics because of the feedback loop where the output of the system can also be an input to the system, are much more difficult to design for and therefore much more interesting.
Amazing. Thank you all for the questions. Dharma,
Yeah.
it's been a pleasure chatting with you. It's not often that we get time with a classically trained philosopher, so I have a new spin on our typical lightning round. I'm going to ask you a few questions that keep me up at night. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool. So we'll start with an easy one. Is water wet?
Yes.
Okay. If soap hits the floor, is the floor clean or is the soap dirty?
Soap's dirty.
Okay. Dirty soap. All right. I have to make sure I pronounce this one the right way.
Right.
Does expecting the unexpected make the unexpected expected?
No.
No, we're going with no. Okay. Final one. You ready?
Yeah.
One word or less. What is the meaning of life?
Oh, I thought the question was one word or less. For those of you who read Douglas Hofstadter, familiar with the history of Buddhism, I'll say mu.
Moo.
Yeah.
We have a minute and 20 seconds left, so I would love to hear more.
It's funny. There is like when I said before, contemporary Anglo-American philosophy is really boring on the one hand, and you take away all the subject matter. There's an enormous corpus of research and argument, and even books written, but certainly like thousands of papers on the question of, do wholes exist? Like H-O-L-E. Like, is there such a thing as a whole, or is it the absence of something? And I swear that is a giant argument. So I find it easier just to come down on the side of one or the other. The meaning of life, I don't know, to love one another.
Okay, I like that one. Ladies and gentlemen, Stewart Butterfield.
Thank you.